Thank you, Rich, filling in at the last moment for Chris Marr, whose name is printed in your program. Life is sacred, sacred in its being born, sacred in its living, sacred too in its dying, sacred in our remembering and sharing, sacred in our hearts always. We have gathered this day, then, to remember and to celebrate the life of Harold Thomas, Jr., known by most of us here at Old Ship as Hal, by most family members and others as Tom, but known in any case by all of us as a beautiful man. We've gathered in sadness to mourn together, of course, in sadness for those who knew Hal well and loved him, feel deeply the loss of his physical presence among us, by our sides. And we've gathered with gratitude, deep gratitude, to honor and celebrate Hal's beautiful life, a life well lived, as we begin to learn to live with Hal in our hearts, in our memories, though no longer walking by our sides. And we light a candle in this spirit to remind us of the light that burns within each soul, each life, a light that is never extinguished, only passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, from generation to generation. Our opening hymn reflects one of Tom's many passions, passion for peace and unity with all life. It's the beautiful tune, Finlandia, This Is My Song. It's number 159. I hope in most of your pews, or all of them, you'll find a hardback hymn book. We did run out of programs. If you are not with a program, you might be near someone who is, and I invite the sharing of programs. It's a tribute to Hal itself that we have not planned well enough for this wonderful gathering. Number 159, This Is My Song. Rise in body or spirit as you're able. Please be seated.
A poem by Lauren Isley, who lived from 1907 to 1977. Essayist, philosopher, scholar, poet. Very important to Hal and Mary. The snowstorm. It is the first and last snows, especially the last, that blinds us most, Thoreau once said. And I wonder what he possibly could have been thinking, since snow is always with us and keeps falling in its proper season, the generations accepting it without first or last, save perhaps this. There is a single snow which a child stores in his memory, the first snow when he falls into a drift, the first snow that reveals secrets like the flake on his sleeve, always to be remembered because it brought knowledge of crystalline perfection, infinite diversity to be tested with his own salt tears, the immeasurable prodigality of the universal worlds in which we are lost, the first and blinding snow of childhood. Second, the view from the farm window, the last, with the black guest waiting at the door. And outside falling and falling, across corn shocks, wheat stubble, plowland, the whiteness of the void. Lucretius must so have seen his atoms and created out of them a world. A wind whipped the flakes aside, perhaps, a snow flurry that conceived a farmhouse kitchen and a stove, made fields, made animals, made men. Look, can you say, I am not composed of snowflakes? My eyes are filled with them. They are falling faster now. Suppose I go outside and join them. Could you say that I was ever here? No, the first blindness is to see the ultimate minute perfection. That is the illusion of the snowdrop. The second is to believe the black guest at the door. My friend, there is only blindness of 1,000,000 years of snowfall. And you and I, wraiths, discoursing as we fall. Do not bother to throw up the window. Snow is already blowing. The room is disassembled. Our substance, the room's substance, is snowflakes. We are falling apart now. We have re-entered the eternal storm. One final word. What one writer said of Lauren Isley could well be said of our Hal. He was one of us, yet most uncommon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. One of us, yet uncommon indeed. Most uncommon. As Elizabeth has said, this poem and Lauren Isley, as a philosopher, essayist, naturalist, very important to Mary and Hal, and they agreed, Mary and Hal did, that this poem should be shared on this occasion following Hal's having re-entered the eternal storm. Isley was direct in the language of this extended metaphor, naming that whatever else we might believe about life and death, it's clear that materially we come from the elements, and to the elements we return. Death, the hinge to life, as Emily Dickinson wrote in those lines near the bottom of your program. Emily, the other woman, as Mary told me she was in Hal's life. Pretty safe, other woman. But Hal was both a materialist, is working with material elements, wood above all, but all the elements, a manifestation of this, He was also a transcendentalist, quite consciously, sensing with Emerson, and those other words printed in your program, that within us is the soul of the whole. Materialist transcendentalist. We experience this materialist transcendentalist Hal here at Old Ship, that's for sure, where Hal and Mary have been so wonderfully and lovingly involved for the past quarter century. Indeed, you can hardly turn around without encountering a piece of Hal's beautiful handiwork. Another member of the building committee, Ron, was pointing out to me that a good number of these spindles have been repaired by Hal at one time or another, or the hinges. He was just paying attention. And then we've got the chair rack covers and the name tag cabinet across the street in the fellowship hall. Elegant name tag cabinet, it ought to be said. And to the podium here at the meeting house. It's a podium we don't often see. Let me tell you about it. We did bring it out. It's here. You still can't see it particularly well from where you are. It's a beautiful piece of his work, and there's a story behind it. It might have been 15 or a little more years ago that Alice Williams, another great soul among us, who has since passed, expressed her concern that every year when the Harvard Glee Club arrived, Jim Marvin, the director, conducted from a chair here that Alice experienced as a dangerous thing. She wanted to do something about it, and she did not work with her hands, but she knew somebody who did. She underwrote the cost, and Hal put his mind to the problem. For a problem it was. Jim wanted to be back there, and he wanted to be elevated. How could you do that? He created a three-piece, I don't know how long he thought about it, but long enough, probably with multiple ideas as to how it might be done. In any case, he pondered, then designed, and the result was an elegant three-piece construction, the two smaller pieces stored within the larger, and instructions for assembly clearly written out and laminated and tucked into a sleeve inside one of the three pieces. I was introducing this to Chris and Rich earlier. It's quite simple, actually, as long as you follow the directions. How about that? And it worked. It worked. Jim Marvin was safe, and now anybody who uses it can save. The whole project in the service of the arts, right? So materially creating this podium in service of transcendent purpose, we might say, the arts. One can imagine music in this case, but one can imagine Hal standing on the podium declaiming Hamlet or some other passage from Shakespeare. So another story. Some of you may recall that at an Old Ship talent show across the street quite a number of years ago, Hal put himself forward, stood up on the stage, and began a soliloquy from Hamlet, and then was silent. He dropped a line, could not recall it. Betty Budlong, another great soul with prodigious memory, gave him the line. Hal experienced this as a failure. He talked about it from time to time over the years. Well, just a few weeks ago, Hal appeared, thanks to Carol Schuler, who is somewhere here. Hal appeared at our monthly Kaylee, our song circle that we hold across the way in the parlor. When it was his turn, he rose from his chair, went to the back of the chair, kind of holding on a little bit, introduced, and then offered his Hamlet soliloquy, apparently with some Hal interpolations along the way. But he didn't miss a beat. It was a transcendent moment. Half the people there had probably never met Hal, because others from outside the church come to the Kaylee. But they knew they had experienced a transcendent moment, not even knowing the history, the story. There was silence, and then there was applause, and then Hal sat down, and we went on. It was beautiful. As was, as I've said, Hal, beautiful. Now, I don't think it was always easy being Hal. Those who knew him well know this. He was a deeply inward person who faced head-on life's big questions and his own life's questions. He had, as most of us do, his own inward struggles. deep struggles sometimes. In other words, he was human, as Elizabeth said. He was one of us, though most uncommon. So it may not have always been easy to be Hal. It's not easy to be any one of us. But it was surely easy to be with Hal. His shining eyes, his warm greeting even a week before his death here in church, greeting everyone present, his obvious pleasure at your company and his full attention to you. His life speaking actually hard-won wisdom he did not need to put into words. For example, he said very little at our men's breakfast, our monthly men's breakfast when he attended. And when he did, it might be cryptic or circuitous. We know that about Hal, but we felt the wisdom embodied in his words and his presence. We may hear more about the arc of his life as the morning goes on, and there are copies, if you haven't seen, of his obituary on a table across the street, to which we're all invited following. The arc of his life from childhood in China, schooling in the States, service as a medic in World War II. He was a pacifist, after all. Almost 60 years living in Hingham, 59 years married to Mary. Shop teacher, drama coach. Is there anybody here who had him as their shop teacher or drama coach here this morning? Maybe not, but there are some online. Raise your hand if you had him in shop. There are some online remembrances of people who remember way back in the 60s. And loving his family above all. Hal, with Thoreau, another of his beloved transcendentalists, lived deep and sucked the marrow out of life, from China to Hingham, striving to see what life had to offer, to paraphrase Thoreau, and not, when he came to die, feel that he had not lived. I liked Hal a lot. We all did, right? Enjoyed simply being in his company, in awe of his beautiful work, his knowledge of literature and philosophy, including all the passages he had in his heart, from Shakespeare to Melville and much else. We've been deeply enriched by his presence here at Old Ship, in our community. Yes, through all the ways he put his material skills to use here, but even more simply by his kind presence, through the example of his witness to peace and justice, about which we may hear more later, a vigil at the post office and much else. And so we grieve his loss, of course. Now we know that most of us grieve not as deeply as his dearest ones. Sitting over here where Hal and Mary sat, Hal and Mary, son Lauren, Suzanne and the kids, Andrea, you're here, and nephews, nieces. Goodness. Let us join our hearts and minds in a spirit of prayer for Hal, for all who grieve. Gracious God, God of many names, source of our lives, source of love. May we feel the presence of love as we grieve and as we help one another along the passage of grief, as we share stories, as we celebrate with gratitude this beautiful and wise life. May those dearest to Hal be comforted by one another and by friends near and far. Be comforted, too, through memories held in mind and heart as they journey what we all know can be a twisting and turning, rising and falling road of grief. With whatever feelings may arise, sometimes contradictory in the midst of the journey, all a measure of love. And may Hal, Tom, having re-entered the snowstorm, returned to the elements, returned to spirit. May he know peace, eternal, and be embraced by enduring love. And we gather our prayers in a moment of silence. Amen.
That was a beautiful piece. Welcome, good morning, and thank you for coming. First off, I'd like to thank my mom for her love, support, and for making Dad's last years truly golden. Thank you, Mom, for all you do. As I look around, I can't help notice how this meeting house embodies many of my dad's qualities: integrity, wisdom, and fellowship being foremost. His reverence for wood and all things well made and engineered. This is the perfect spot to celebrate his life. My dad and I would often talk about projects we are doing, rarely needing a sketch to communicate. We were on the same page. He always had great input and usually a better way of doing things. He was a team player, an all-man's man, as I'd like to call him, able to recite Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson at a whim. He would casually slip in a verse during conversation. He would always meet you on your level, always present, always engaged. Never one to brag or let on that he was an encyclopedia of knowledge, humble and honest. He had the great capacity to laugh at himself. When a project wasn't going according to plan, I would kid him and say, "We may not be good, but we're slow." He loved that expression and would always laugh out loud. He was ready for whatever the situation required. Nothing was too big or too small for him. Always calm, always in control. Naturally, there are many stories and memories that come to mind. I'd like to touch on one story in particular that exemplifies the richness of our time together. There's a little backstory, so bear with me. Growing up in the Thomas house was a little different from growing up in the surrounding houses. We made everything from scratch, maintained our appliances, built our own walls, fixed our own cars, sweated our own pipes. It was a real education on being self-reliant. As I'd like to say, we were only 2 cars away from being Amish. My dad was an industrial arts teacher by profession. Combining his passion of helping people and building things, he was a creative problem solver and a master craftsman unlike anyone I've ever met. His shop at South Weymouth Junior High School was immaculate. I call it a shop, it was more like a laboratory. Each tool indexed by an outline and a cleverly made bracket. It contained a foundry, lathes, and every tool needed for metal fabrication. There was also an adjacent wood shop, equally equipped. One could build anything there with enough imagination and ambition, and he certainly had both. This is where our story begins. It was 1980, and I was 16 years old with a newly minted learner's permit. I think we still had a rotary phone. It was pretty much the Wild West by today's standards. There's a wood stove craze sweeping the Northeast. Your typical family would have gone out and bought a stove and had the wood delivered. We're not your typical family. That should be pretty clear by now. My dad and I built our wood stove in that laboratory of his. He engineered it to slide into our existing fireplace, cut a hole in the back wall of the chimney, and inserted a fan to circulate the hot air. The stove wasn't a half-baked 55-gallon drum on its side either. It was highly engineered, airtight, fire-breathing beast. The Corning glass door provided proof of that. It had levers and knobs to regulate the draft. Think Wizard of Oz, man behind the curtain kind of stuff. There was one thing missing: wood. Lucky for us, my grandmother's house in Stoddard, New Hampshire, was about a 2.5-hour ride on a good day. It is situated on an 8-acre lot with plenty of wood to cut. A date was set. It was February vacation. The vehicle of choice was our newly restored 1951 International pickup. That's a story for another day. With a trailer in tow, a 24-inch Homelite gas chainsaw occupying the bed, and the driver, yours truly. We made it there safe and sound on a cold crystal blue morning. We cut wood all day, each taking turns, felling trees, moving brush, loading the truck and trailer. By noon, the blue skies had disappeared. and there were flurries in the air. By 3, the snow was coming down at a pretty good clip. I think we rolled out of there around dusk with a fully loaded truck and trailer, a 16-year-old boy behind the wheel, and a good 5 inches of snow on the ground. The conditions weren't favorable. At no point did I get a sense from my dad that this might be a bad idea. As I navigated our way through the winding back roads of New Hampshire, the driving was surprisingly uneventful until we got to Peterborough. Here there's a long incline, a good 5 miles of unplowed mountain road. Towards the top, things become steep. It was at this point when our tires began to slip on our trusty two-wheel drive antique. Our forward progress slowed and the truck nearly stopped. It was clear we weren't going to make it. Without a word or a swear, my dad hops out of the truck as if he's done this before. I wasn't quite sure what was happening or what to expect. I eventually felt the truck surge ahead ever so slightly. With the wheels spinning, the engine revving, he had pushed us to the top. An incredible feat. As we crested the hill, he hopped in the cab. We both laughed in amazement. I remember as we started our descent, he said, "Leave it in low, let the engine do the braking, and we should be all right." He was right. He was always right. All in a day's work for my dad, but a lifetime of inspiration for me and so many others. A difference maker, a game changer. He closed the gap. He made all things possible. A true original, a great dad and friend. It's a bittersweet time, but there's much joy knowing that his spirit lives on in so many. He truly made a difference in this world. All we can do now is celebrate. I don't think you'd want it any other way. Thank you, Dad, for all that you've bestowed on us. We love you. Be good. Peace.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Will and Olivia. Speak right into the mic.
Sorry about that. Having Harold Thomas as my grandfather is a blessing that will continue throughout my whole life. He introduced me to the many wonders of life, sparked my curiosity through his endless supply of stories, and provided me a template for conducting a life of true happiness. I want to share with you just a glimpse of the joys that have come from being the grandson of Harold Thomas. From the day of my birth, my grandfather has always been there for me, from picking me up at the bus stop in elementary school to withstanding brutally cold youth football and hockey games, to my graduation from high school. He was always there. His omnipresence continues today as I see him just about everywhere I look, whether it's a bird calmly soaring, navigating a current of wind, or a cool breeze caressing my back. I feel him there with me still. To hear that my grandfather was a transcendentalist came as no surprise, as many of my childhood memories with him revolved around nature. Whether it be barefoot meditation in the morning dew of the grass, scaling the rocks of Nantasket Beach, or wading the murky waters of Houghton's Pond, my grandfather was the catalyst for my infatuation with the outdoors. And in nature is where I will forever find him. Of all of his admirable qualities, I think the one I admired the most was his playful stubbornness. And this only increased with age. Most of you are either familiar or have witnessed his affinity for precarious situations, like scaling ladders and mounting rooftops into his late 80s. When given a walker and told that his mobility would be decreased, his intentions were quite the opposite. For those who are not aware, telling my grandfather to do something or to not do something was pretty counterintuitive. It did not take him long to find out that he could in fact move much faster than he had before when he gave the walker a bit of a push and hoisted himself in the air. Although this may have caused my family and many of you a panic or two, I will forever treasure these moments of his whimsical mischief. Having led a life of such genuine peace and happiness, it's been hard to say goodbye to the man who has done so much for my family, our community, and the world as a whole. But with every glimpse of nature, every speck of sawdust, and every bite of chocolate, I know he is still here with us and will always be.
Harold Thomas had a full repertoire of roles: father, teacher, friend, craftsman, husband, the list goes on, but I had the pleasure of knowing him as granddad. Looking through photos from my childhood these past couple of weeks, my grandfather is an ever-present figure. My brother and I were lucky enough to have grown up just a 15-minute drive from my grandparents' house, and even more, to have spent 2 days a week with them from infancy through young adulthood. As such, our childhoods were filled with excitement and adventure that fostered creative expression through dance, art, imaginative play, and woodworking. As a craftsman, my grandfather was able to bring many of our ideas to life, whether they be a car made from old boxes or a 3-story wooden house for one of my many stuffed animals. But even with his high level of knowledge and great skill in construction, our creations were always collaborative efforts. He provided the tools we needed, literally and figuratively, and then took a step back and let us work, giving guidance only where needed. We spent many afternoons creating in his workshop, and much like him, even with its strong, rough exterior, it was filled with warmth. My grandfather was not just present, but enthusiastic, engaged, and always interested in what was going on in our worlds. He would inquire about our latest reading assignments and projects and listen attentively as we attempted to explain to him the plot of a book or a part of history that I'm sure he knew far better than us. He brought me to gymnastics practices and attended many of Will's sports games, no matter the weather. He even took an interest in Beyoncé after her Super Bowl performance and referred to her as Pionce and regularly checked up on her. Just a few weeks ago, we were in the car and he asked me to compare her to Bruce Springsteen. An interesting comparison. I tried my best to indulge his curiosity. It was never really about Beyoncé, though. Well, maybe a little. But mostly it was about connecting with us and bridging the gap between our worlds, which he would go great lengths to do. As we both grew older, our adventures didn't cease. I took on a new role of driver when my grandfather so graciously relinquished ownership of his '99 Toyota Camry to me. Together, we began a series of missions, some quick and easy and others that required patience and dedication. We went to the Big Y, the post office, and Anchor Press, a printing company for which we should have been awarded a frequent flyer card. We visited the Cam Man, the First Baptist Church of Wollaston, Weston Reprographics, and various other places scattered across the South Shore. For him, aside from accomplishing some tasks that had been on his to-do list for some time, I know that he appreciated the opportunity to get out of the house. For me, the Camry became the next wood shop, a common ground where we could learn from each other, where we laughed and his curiosity about school and friends continued, and where I learned a lot about his life, specifically growing up in China. There are so many memories of my grandfather that I could share with you to describe our relationship and his devotion to his grandkids. But I have realized that it is not so much the individual memories, but the whole of them that best shows this. As his favorite poet, Emily Dickinson, so succinctly put it, forever is composed of nows, and all of the nows that we shared come together to reveal a thoughtful, gentle, curious, patient, and playful man. As kids, we used to play a game called Solemn Occasion. To play this game, which was taught to us by my grandfather, everyone sitting at the table would unfold their napkin and place it on their head. Then, one person, usually my grandfather, would begin with, "This is a very solemn occasion," and keeping a straight face, proceed to give reason that would break the others into laughter. It was rare that we made it past the opening line before exploding with amusement. Anyways, I bring up this game because on his last day, as we arrived in his hospice room, my grandfather said to us, "This is not a solemn occasion, it is a marvelous one." It was a bittersweet remark, evoking both playfulness and a sense of finality that was accompanied by reassurance. In an interview we did in 2015 for StoryCorps, I asked my grandfather what his family's legacy was. Excuse me. He responded that what he wanted to pass on to his grandchildren was a happy life. Reasons for having a happy life: the necessary resources, a happy home, a supportive community, school, church, and good values, personal and political. So, Granddad, in your own words, here we is at the end, and you have no doubt succeeded in leaving us with this legacy. You have provided us with unconditional love and showed us what a healthy, loving relationship looks like. You and Mary have chosen a beautiful town for our family, where we have been able to receive both an excellent educations and find kind and accepting communities like Old Ship Church. You have passed on your creativity, your ability to problem solve, your passion for activism, your sense of humor, your sweet tooth, no doubt, and so much more. So for all of these things, I want to say thank you. Because in the beautiful, happy lives you have helped us create, you are scattered throughout in a way that makes you still an ever-present figure. And for that, I will be forever grateful.
perhaps needless to say, all the music chosen by Hal and Mary for today. In a moment, I'll be requesting that others who may have a brief recollection, we'll have a little bit of time for the sharing. But first, Mary has asked that I read something written by someone from afar and sent to us. Old Ship members remember Kathy Fry, who now lives in California with her son Devin. And Kathy writes, for many of us who knew Hal Thomas, I'm sure if asked what difference did Hal make in your life, you'll be able to tell rich stories to represent this good man with gentle, strong, but youthful, wise character who touched you deeply. Same is true for me and my son Devin, Kathy writes. She indicates she's sorry not to be here, but distance does not preclude this sharing. She wrote, Mary and Hal Thomas were first introduced to my son and me 14 years ago when we were dealing with some major challenges. Ken Reed Brown introduced us to them knowing they had something special to share. Little did I realize at the time how they would become like family, sharing their lives and experiences with us. We shared much conversation, time, meals, holidays, music, events. Since our first encounter, our relationship has been a blessing. When I've described Hal to people who didn't know him, I tell of a man with a fascinating upbringing, a loving husband and father, an older man who refused to let age limit him. Talk about the times he climbed onto the Old Ship rooftop to make repairs, and how few of those times my son got to climb up there with him. I share how he and Mary used to stand at the post office with signs advocating for justice related to a variety of different issues, as well as how involved he and Mary have been in the community. To those close to me, Kathy goes on, I tell a deeper story of the belief, advocacy, never-dying love Hal and Mary have repeatedly demonstrated for us, the thoughtful conversations we've had, the times when a man in his 80s and a boy in his young teens, her son Devin, enjoyed each other's company. From refurbishing a chicken barn and turning it into a beautiful home, to teaching others how to build, Hal was always resourceful. Devin and I remember when Hal needed a seat for his car and how the two of them had great fun rummaging through piles at the junkyard for just the right find. And even as recently as November, on a visit, Hal shared information about how to get help for a leaky toilet in my home. Much like my own father, Kathy says, Hal was a lifelong learner. Numerous projects he wasn't working on them, he'd be spending time with people in need. When my son broke his back and I had to work, Hal visited my son in our home. He would bring Devin a sub-galley sub sandwich. During their visits, Hal told his stories and Devin taught Hal how to use Google Maps to get satellite photos of where he grew up in China. As Mary said the other day, he never lost a connection with China. Beautiful circles there. Kathy says, when my son was recuperating and needing physical therapy, Hal would pick him up. They'd both go swimming at a nearby rec center. As is true for many of us, our memories of Hal will continue, but I return to the initial question, what difference did Hal make in my life? He reminded me of the goodness in people. By observing how he lived his life, I saw that growing older is just part of the journey, and keeping active is the way to age. By being a witness to how he lived the end of his life, I was reminded of how important it is to be reflective and to plan for what's ahead. Hal helped to make the rearing of an adolescent son as a single mom be more adventurous and fun. Hal's and Mary's love, partnership, and mutual respect for each other was and still is an inspiration, as it is for so many of us, Mary. Hal and Mary instilled an understanding that even as we say goodbye, the love remains and is eternal. Kathy concludes, thank you, Hal. Blessed be. And as she reflects on the end of his life, as maybe most of you, but maybe not all of you know, it was the day that Hal entered hospice. Olivia alluded to this, and thank you, Olivia, for Will and Lauren for your beautiful sharings. It was on that same day they entered, and not long after they had settled, that Hal, and he saw the words at the top of his program, he said, I'm sitting in the catbird seat, as he looked around at his family and out at the view. And it was in that setting that he died peacefully surrounded by his family. A beautiful end for a beautiful life. We could spend days here in this meeting house sharing stories. I know that, and I've heard from folks during this week who I had no idea would have had any reason to know Hal, but who did and appreciated him. We do have a little bit of time before we go across the street, and I'm going to give to our ushers 2 microphones. And if you raise your hand and for a brief message, please, tell us who you are and then share your message. I see hands already. And hold the mic close so that we can all hear. And we'll start right here.
Thank you. I'm Tom, and Hal always said Mr. Thomas, kind of connected him. I belong to a men's group at the Glastonbury Abbey, and Hal was with us. And we honored him as our senior member. I used to be the senior member, but he took over, kind of bothered me a little bit, but we loved him. And he always, every time he left, he'd say, and he was with us for years, he'd say, I might not be with you next week, so next month. But he always showed up. And he would just, whenever he talked to you, you felt like you were just somebody special, you know? So good to see you, Mr. Thomas. So good to hear your voice, you know? And it made me feel, wow, I must be somebody. And one of our members wrote a little book about cancer, and he always would say, Russ, you know, how's your book coming? What's going on? And every once in a while, the meeting would keep going on because Hal would kind of ramble on. And it was hard to kind of, but whenever you say something, Hal, your 2 minutes has turned into an hour, and he would say, oh, sorry, and never get hurt or upset about that. And it was wonderful. And one little last story, my wife just kind of said to me, you know, it's a wonder he trusted you to paint his house. And my son and I painted his house, and then there was some carpentry work. And he was really upset that my son would have to do it. Oh, I'll do it, because it was up 2 stories high, you know, they had to go up a ladder. And they argued, because my son's a perfectionist too. And I thought my son would leave, because he wasn't going to take, you know. And he did the work. And every time I drove up to take him to the men's club, he used to say, I love looking at my house. You guys did such a great job. So we really loved him, and we're going to miss him in our group. We met at the Hingham Library just a couple of weeks ago, and he was there. Thank you
so much. I think back here for another few words. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. You've heard mention this morning of China. I am the China connection. Years ago, when Tom was growing up, his father, as you've seen in the obituary, Waupay Hospital. I had the pleasure of going there 2 years ago. It's now called the number 2 hospital in Ningpo. I don't know why, you know, Chinese people say number 2, number 1, whatever, Charlie Chan, number 1 son, etc. But anyway, number 2 hospital. And on the ground floor and also on the second floor, there are about 4 to 6 panels describing the history of the hospital, mentioning Tom's father, Dr. Harold Thomas, as well as my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. And, you know, the whole history of the place. And as the communists started to take over in 49, his family had to leave. And so my mother and my father, they were in China, but they came to this country in 62, or I came in 62. And they reconnected with Tom and his parents in Loudonville, outside of Albany. And they've kept in touch for the last, 50-something years. And, you know, my mother, she passed away last year at 91 rather. And Tom came down. Lauren drove him. And so thank you, Lauren, for that. She really appreciated it. So, I mean, just, you know, looking at the 300-ish people in this room, We all know he was a kind and caring person. He really remembered his past, didn't forget people. And so I think this, the turnout really shows what a wonderful person we all feel he is. So thank you.
Well, thank you for completing the China Circle for us. Beautiful. We have time for a few more.
Hi, I'm Jessie Flaherty. I just wanted to share another ladder story because for my mother's college graduation, we had a surprise party, and Hal helped me design a way to distribute balloons from the ceiling. And so we had a framework and we had a sheet, and the sheet held the balloons, and there was a string through the top of it that went around to pulleys, and we had
high ceiling in the fellowship hall.
yeah, that's the thing. It was getting it up there. And so if you know the roof of the parish hall inside is like this, and the only way to get to a ladder to it is to put it here down to the floor. And so normally when you're up on a ladder, if it falls, you just ride down the side of the house with it. But this one, if it falls, it just falls. And there was no falling and there was no fear. And he and I took turns bringing stuff up the ladder. And it's just insane. He had no fear. He had a solid love of everything. And it was one of the most glorious collaborations that I've ever experienced.
Thank you, Jessie. Thank you. We'll move over here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lulu. I met Hal when I was 12 years old because I was dead set on renovating the playground behind Old Ship. About a year later, part of Old Ship, we have to choose a mentor. And I feel silly now because in the moment that I chose Hal, I didn't understand what a brilliant choice I made. But he taught me the beauty of intergenerational relationships. We spoke about why bad things happen to good people and what happens after we pass. So now I'm just sitting here, just so grateful and keen on growing up and displaying the conditionless love that he showed me. And I'm really glad to be here with everyone.
Maybe a couple more right here.
Reverend Brown, Mary, it's a privilege to be here among all of you folks to pay tribute to this man who is a man for all seasons. When much of the Eastern Europe was just emerging from dreadful isolation of several centuries, Hal was there to help tiny Albania. And it's a privilege to represent the Albanian Humanitarian Aid Association, of which he and Mary were instrumental in helping so many folks who were emerging from slavery in that country. And God bless him. It's very clear to me and to all of you that Hal was a man who was true to himself in thought, in word, and in deed.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Yes, right back, I think.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Dave Buchanan, and yes, I will. It's pretty amazing to be in this building today. As you said, Lauren, it's like being in the presence of Tom, being here. But my family and the Thomases became fast friends in the early 1960s when Mary came to our door while canvassing for a political candidate on Beacon Hill. I was 3 then, but Mary and Tom remain as second parents, as they doubtless are to so many of those assembled here today. And many thanks, Lauren, for sharing them with so many of us over the years. I wrote a lot here, and I'm not going to read all of this, but one of the things that cemented the friendship between our families was our adventures on the water. Following our last major escapade that Tom and I had, the tales took on a rather epic proportion when Tom and I exchanged written accounts of them borrowing heavily from Moby Dick. Call Tom Ahab. Though he was far from an Ahab, I think. The first adventure was the stuff of legend, at least in our family. Within the first few years of becoming friends, my father invited Tom out for a sail aboard a small boat that we kept in Salem, Mass. All went well until the very end, when Tom inadvertently dropped his car keys overboard. A problem. As the tale has it, he dove in after them and reemerged so fast that he didn't even get wet. Providential waters, as Tom said. He said, swat old peg-leg twinkle toes off the deck. Dry baptism, he said. Nary a drop of dampness. A miracle. The baptism did prove providential. All came ashore. Tom, now minus keys, and being who he was, promptly hot-wired the car and drove home. And within the year, Lauren was born. So the second adventure, I will spare the details of that with you, but suffice it to say it was a bit more of a wet baptism, and it involved a canoe and a lake. And the last adventure that prompted the letters between us took place quite some years ago when Tom was but a youngster in his 70s. I had invited him up to Gloucester, north of Boston here, for an afternoon sail. The day arrived, but with the threat of thunderstorms. You know where we're going with this tale. We talked by phone. Being stubborn Yankees, we agreed to press on despite the forecast. Tom had his own solo adventure on the way up when his faithful Toyota pickup blew a cooling hose on the Tobin Bridge. For Tom, of course, that was but a minor skirmish with the fates. He soon had it repaired, and so we met up and rowed out to the sailboat with the looming clouds growing more ominous by the moment. Rain began, then the wind set in. There we were, just a scant league from the unforgiven shore, with bolts from the Almighty striking all about us. As Tom put it, our previous adventures were in comparison but a little moisture behind the ears. And visions appeared. Praise all the saints of the seven seas, there was a sighting of that critter Moby Dick to keep the watch wakeful. With no cabin for shelter, it was time to head for shore. But with the wind, we could easily end up at sea, and the wall of rain threatened to sink the rowboat. As we set out, it was all I could do to keep us heading in, while Tom bailed furiously in the stern. As he put it, "'Twasn't for me old humble steady state Starbuck, with his bare hands and them oars thrashing the seas to keep the bow to the wind, no telling what might have happened." And there's Tom, full force of the storm, right in the face, pelting straight from Jehovah, rain like bullets. All the while, he's bailing with one hand and chomping on a sandwich with the other. Nary a concern in the world. And so it was that the fearless crew returned from the great adventure without setting a single stitch of sail to the wind, but with some fine tall tales for the ages. And now, Tom, our friend and trusted shipmate, as you cross over the open waters to the other side, here's wishing you fair winds and a calm crossing. Fare thee well.
Thank you. I think there's someone right behind.
Hi, I first met Uncle Tom on a Thanksgiving day in Stoddard, New Hampshire, where my sons and I had been invited by Jeffrey, Tom's nephew. And I remember a few sweet things from that day. But the biggest one, I think, is just the love and the acceptance and that Tom and Mary showed to us. And the biggest pumpkin I've ever seen in my life, which was grown by Lauren, who must have been 10 or 11 at the time. I have a little poem that I'd like to read, but I first want to say I'm so grateful for knowing Tom and for his humble genius and all the beauty he has left in the world. So this little poem, it's called Turn Again to Life by Mary Lee Hall. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others sore undone, who keep long vigils by the silent dust and weep. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort weaker hearts than thine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I, perchance, may therein comfort you.
Hey, who's that old guy standing on his head over there? Oh, that's just Tom. He's prone to do that occasionally.
Much as that would be a great image to finish with, we'll conclude here.
It would be. I'm Paula Nicolai, and I just want to say that I was a colleague of Hal's, Hal to me, at South Junior High School. And at the time, I was an adjustment counselor. We're educators here that worked with him. And he was just a magnificent man. He was totally accepting. And I, as an adjustment counselor, had the opportunity to work with many challenged youngsters, most of them boys, but oftentimes girls also. And I always knew where to go. When I had a child who was challenged and I'd have to make deals with the guidance department to say, please, 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 let me get these youngsters down to spend more time with Hal. And he was just totally accepting and changed many lives, including those of us who worked with him, because he also did much with us in the schools with the drama. And he was just always there in the gentlest of ways, in the kindest of ways. And I shall never forget him.
Thank you all. And for the stories unshared here, do continue to share them with one another, certainly with Mary and her family. We've been reminded of how many lives, come on forward, Ursula, of how many lives Hal touched. It may feel as though there are lots of people in this meeting house, and there are, but nowhere near the number of lives touched and influenced and changed for the better by Hal.
Ursula Stone. I will be reading a poem that was close to Hal's heart. Almost, I will start again. I will be reading a poem that was close to Hal's heart. Almost every time I saw him, he would begin a conversation about this very poem, trying again and again to fathom the meaning of the poem's German words, trying repeatedly to examine the English translations. I will read the poem first in German, then in English. Please note that for a variety of reasons, I will read a translation that is different from the translation printed in your program. Raine Maria Rilke, Der Schwan. Diese Mühsal, durch noch Ungetanes schwer und wie gebunden hinzugehen, gleicht dem ungeschaffenen Gang des Schwanes. Und das Sterben, dies nicht mehr fassen jenes Grunds, auf dem wir täglich stehen, seinem ängstlichen sich niederlassen in die Wasser, die ihn sanft empfangen und die sich wie glücklich und vergangen unter ihm zurückziehen, Flut um Flut, während er unendlich still und sicher, immer mündiger und königlicher und gelassener zu ziehen geruht. Rainer Maria Rilke, The Swan. Translation by Joanna Macy and Anita Barrows. This laboring of ours, with all that remains undone as if still bound to it, is like the lumbering gait of the swan. And then our dying, releasing ourselves from the very ground on which we stood, is like the way he hesitantly lowers himself into the water. It gently receives him and, gladly yielding, flows back beneath him as wave follows wave, while he, now wholly serene and sure, with regal composure, allows himself to glide. With calm and grace and serenity.
Ursula, right by the mic.
Oh, sorry. With calm and grace and serenity, may you, Hal, glide and journey forth in your new realm of existence.
Thank you so much, Ursula. Going to sing again. You may or may not, I think most of you will have the soft-covered hymn books.
And